Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to this new museumexpert.org event. We are happy today to welcome John Falk, well-known author in the museum field. He is emeritus professor at Oregon State University and the leader and director of Institute for Learning Innovation. He recently published a book about the value of museums and how it can enhance societal well-being. And we were very much intrigued by that because what Museum Expert is about is not only about the well-being that museums provide to society, but also how well-being can be provided to people who work for museums. And this is the professionals that we address mostly with our events. He will be in a conversation with Mikko, from the CEO from Heureka in Finland, who is actually not there at that point in Heureka, but that's the magic of the online event. So not only are these two eminent people in the museum field and well known and have a long experience, but they are two good friends of mine. So we're really thankful for them to joining me today for this conversation. And before starting, I have to actually thank the American Alliance of Museums again for offering us the platform to be able to do this today, and also to promote this event in many ways. So thanks to the 2AM for that. There is little organization here. We will have the conversation starting in a second, but be aware that you can ask questions in the Q&A session. You can speak to each other, but you can also address questions to the panelists at the end of the session. So about 10 minutes before the end, we will look at questions that came in, and then we will be able to address a couple of them with the speakers. So once again, welcome for being here. I am going to go off now and leave the floor to John and Mikko, and I hand it over to Mikko now to start the conversation. Thanks again, and see you after that.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Colleen, in backstage, and thank you, Museum Expert, for having us. It's always a pleasure to have a chat with John, and I think this occasion with all you following and on the occasion of this great new book that you have published, The Value of Museums, makes it very special indeed. And it's just not another book by John Falk, and interesting because of that, but I think it's also quite a giant leap in your thinking, John, because we've known for decades, and you've been even longer studying why people visit museums. And you have always emphasized the fact that people don't miss museums for something else. They know that museums are something about learning. They are not mixing up with an amusement park or so. And now in this book, you are actually not talking about learning, but you are talking about enhanced well-being. And I think we should first discuss this step that you have taken. So please, John, explain us what happened to your thinking, why the focus is not in learning.
Thanks, Mikko. And thank you again, Walter and Colleen, for inviting me to speak today. Yes, it is true. For the vast majority of my 40 plus, pushing 50 years now, career, I, like many others, viewed the museum experience through the lens of learning. And learning indeed does consistently happen when people visit museums, but other things happen too. Other things that stretch beyond even my very, very broad definition of learning. So as I continued my this lifelong quest to understand the outcomes and benefits that museums create through their museum experiences, starting around 20 years ago, I began to sort of, to be honest, more fully appreciate that learning itself was clearly part of the story, but it was in service to a deeper need, that need to build and support one's sense of self and identity. So for a decade or so, that's where I focused my energies. But then about 10 years ago, I started another book project where I think in that book, which is called Born to Choose, I even mentioned museums once or twice, but it's a book really about the evolutionary origins of the self. But as I was trying to write about the evolution of self, I realized that self itself was in service to a deeper need. And that deeper, arguably most deep of all fundamental living needs is what I call well-being. So here we are. As I was trying to write a book about the value of museums and particularly the role that museum experiences play in supporting that value, primarily what has changed was not the data. The data has stayed the same for nearly 50 years. It's how I interpreted that data, initially through the paradigmatic lens of learning, and then for nearly a decade through the lens of identity and self, and now through the lens of well-being. So here we are.
Thanks,
In
John.
summary, learning is a way to build and facilitate self. Self is a way to build and facilitate well-being. And so I come to the conclusion, based on this extensive data, on how people make sense and what the meaning for people is that they take away from museum experiences. And what I came to the conclusion was that there are many reasons people go to museums, including learning, but also social cohesion and physical recharging and lots of other things. And all these reasons lead back to a single idea, that most fundamental level, that the reason people visit places like museums and the primary benefit they derive as a consequence is enhancement of their well-being.
Okay, John, thanks for clarification. And now I think we should have a look at well-being in a close-up, because I know that you define well-being somewhat differently than when we in everyday discussion talk about well-being. So could you please elaborate on the topic of well-being?
Absolutely. So there's good news and bad news. Well-being is one of these terms that is quite au courant. Lots of people talk about well-being. And it's taken on sort of this pop psychology meaning, essentially synonymous with happiness and wellness. In fact, there's a great term in Finnish, or maybe it's Danish for that. I think it's the Danes have a great term. Maybe the Finns do too, but which I can't pronounce at the moment. Anyway, happiness, wellness, these are all definitely aspects of well-being, but they're not well-being as I define it. So how do I define it? So first and foremost, I frame well-being not from a psychological perspective, although there's certainly psychology involved in that, but primarily as a biological phenomenon. And well-being is not, as most psychologists frame it, a uniquely human phenomenon. It is a fundamental aspect of what it means to be alive. In fact, I would argue, and I have argued in this other book that I wrote, that the perception of well-being is actually the secret of life. It's what distinguishes living things from non-living things. Living things, even the simplest bacteria, are capable of perceiving things that affect their well-being. Whether if a bacterium bumps up against a toxic substance, it moves away. Bacteria learn what is toxic, and so they will avoid things that weren't hardwired into their genome, and actually will learn to positively move towards things that are support their thriving and move away from things that negatively affect that thriving. So at its core, well-being is about achieving balance. Being in balance feels good, and being out of balance feels bad. Although this need for a sense of well-being is fundamental and pervasive, it's surprising how difficult it is for most people to describe what it means to have well-being. But despite that, being able to put words on that, and as I'll talk about later on, It's because well-being evolved long before we had language. I mean, it's much deeper than language. And so it's not surprising that maybe we haven't figured out how to describe it, but we know it when we feel it. We know when we feel secure. We know when we feel satiated. We know when we feel loved. We also know when we feel sick or when we feel unwell, or people are saying, you know, we perceive that people are not accepting of us. We have those feelings, and those are very, very visceral, very tangible. We may struggle to put words on it, but we feel it, we understand it. And so at its most fundamental level, all of these things evolved for a purpose, and they evolved to maximize our survival, which is why we as humans constantly monitor and attempt to control our well-being. We try to take advantage of and maximize things that make us feel good or positive, and try to avoid things that are negative. But the big thing to appreciate is, again, unlike the way it's been framed in, particularly in this positive psychology mode, as somehow this elusive thing that you can attain. You can be, if you just follow these 10 steps, you can learn how to be happy, or you can learn how to be healthy. Well, the truth is, health, happiness, all those things are ephemeral. And you never obtain happiness. You never obtain health. It's all relative. It's all compared to how I was yesterday. So maybe I feel better today than I did yesterday, but tomorrow I might feel bad again, depending on whether, you know, I get in an argument with my significant other and makes me feel bad, or I catch the flu. And even though I may have felt healthy yesterday, today I feel miserable. But then I get over the flu and then I feel good again. And so we go through these ups and downs, but it's a never-ending struggle to achieve well-being. And over evolutionary time, we've evolved tens of thousands of ways to monitor and control various things that relate to our well-being. And in particular, I have summarized them as falling into 4 basic areas. And it turns out that museums support all 4 of these. So the most recently evolved, the most fundamentally human of them all, is what I call personal well-being. It's this sense of wonder and interest and curiosity. And as I look out my window here in Oregon, and I see that the foliage is turned, beautiful colors, fall colors. And I'm think, well, isn't that beautiful? I also am cognizant of the fact that my backyard, since I live adjoining lots and lots of forests, is full of deer and other critters. And I can assure you those deer are not spending a lot of time sitting around admiring the beauty of the foliage as it turns golden and red. That's not something that other life forms do, but we humans do that. And one of the reasons we go to museums is because museums are a place that support that sense of awe and wonder and facilitate that ability to make sense of ourselves and build our identities. There's also this thing called intellectual well-being. This is where learning comes in. Museums are also good at that. We humans are uniquely focused on learning. We are learning creatures, and we learn all the time. Because again, learning turned out to be fundamental to how we survived. As has often been commented, we weren't the biggest and strongest and baddest creatures, at least initially, weren't the baddest creatures on the savannah when we emerged there some 5-6 million years ago, but we were damn near the smartest. And we used those smarts as a way to control our survival. And our lives as humans have continually evolved to depend on that ability to make sense of the world and use that intelligence in ways to understand what happened to us in the past and to use that knowledge to enhance our future. But we're also fundamentally social creatures. And that social notion of being part of a group is very deep. It's fundamental to being a mammal. In fact, it's fundamental to many groups of vertebrates, but it evolved literally hundreds of millions of years ago. And we spend an awful lot of our day and our time trying to do things that enhance our social well-being. And museums also play a role in that. Museums are places we can go with families, with groups, and learn about who we are as individuals and how we fit in together. And finally, physical well-being. We like to believe, as many psychologists like to believe, that we live in our heads, but we don't. We live in our bodies. And at the base, again, of that Maslow pyramid, we spend over half of every day making sure that we have enough food in our bodies, that we sleep. We are sexual creatures. We worry about all those kinds of things. That comes and goes, but people don't like to talk about that. Maslow didn't like to talk about that, but in the middle of the 20th century. But, these are realities. And museums are places people go to because they feel safe and secure. And as the pandemic made clear, if people don't feel safe and secure in these spaces, guess what? They won't come. And so, and that's the same, is equally true about the virtual environment. If you don't feel safe online, you won't go there. So, again, that's how I define well-being.
Excellent, John. This really reminds me that you are a biologist by formation.
Yes.
Your background. So in a way, you are back in your roots when you are taking the evolutionary concept of well-being rather than something colloquial we might in chatting use. Yep. Good. So maybe you could now give us an understanding of the structure of your book. So now we understand the well-being context and the focus and the lens. But what about the whole book, the value of museums? How do you build this up for us?
Sure, and I'll try and give you really a very, very brief synopsis, and I suspect we'll go into detail on some of these issues, much as we've already gone into detail about well-being. But where the focus of the book really is on this need for museums to more clearly and definitively define their value to society, to, as the late Stephen Weil said, move from what is currently the position of museums perceived as nice, but not necessary. And it was actually in search of a way to help museums achieve this goal that I wrote this book. And it was in that spirit that I actually went through this journey and arrived at this notion that at the core of what museums do, and historically have done well, is support the public's well-being. So the book starts out making this case, and then I proceed to lay out what I mean by well-being, as I did a minute ago. And then I spend a good part of the book talking about actually what does that look like specifically within a museum context. And there's a chapter each on what does enhanced personal well-being look like in a museum context? What does enhanced intellectual well-being look like in a museum context? Social well-being, physical well-being. What do those look like? How would you know when that's happening? And what is the evidence for that? And then I get into what I believe is both the most important as well as potentially the most controversial part of this book, is the belief that you can talk about the value, but the value of the museum ultimately has to be actionable. You have to actually be able to demonstrate that value to the people for whom this case is being made, and that's the public, and in particular, policymakers, funders. So you have to speak their language. And so there's a book devoted to how you would go about actually measuring the value of museum experiences. And dare I say, taking it even beyond just measuring it, speaking the speak of policymakers. How do you monetize that? Because the language of policymakers, of funders, is money. That's what they have to give. They can talk about, well, isn't it great that you guys do this and hospitals do that and the schools do that? But I'm ultimately left with making a decision of who to give this money to. That's what I have. And so how do I dish it out? What is it really worth? What's the return on investment? So if I give you 10 euros, $10, what do I get back in return? And I don't want, lofty language. I want to know what the return on investment is. And so I go there and talk about how to do that. And then ultimately, in the last couple chapters, I say, okay, well, that's great. This is how you can do that. But how do we use these insights in actionable ways to support the long-term health and well-being, the future value and sustainability of museums? So here are practical suggestions that you can make to enhance the quality of museum experiences. And this is how you'd use these insight that if the value of museums is enhanced well-being, how do you leverage that to make the future of museums more sustainable and valuable? And that, in a nutshell, is the book.
By the way, the Danish word you were referring to about well-being is hygge.
Yeah, hygge.
And that's Danish. But Finland also is figuring somehow here, because for many years in a row, we've been #1 in the World Happiness Index, which of course is not really measuring happiness, but it's also, I would say that it's measuring whether people are content in their lives, whether their society is functioning.
Correct.
So it's about functionality rather. Okay, that's a side note to your Danish Scandinavian comment. But I think what you just described us is a remarkable research problem. And it's not just framing a question, but it's really figuring out how you can grasp that value. Because you just said that well-being is very ephemeral and it goes up and down on a daily basis. So people who visit us, people who visit museums, they walk away with that idea of well-being or that feeling of well-being. What methods do you suggest that we could use to, or is it even tangible enough to get hold on?
Well, and this historically has been the challenge, as people have talked about the outcomes of museum experiences in general and of well-being in particular. They've always talked about it as somehow, and in fact, it literally is in the research defined as intangible outcomes. But I would argue that it's perceived as intangible if you frame it through a psychological lens, as you think about it as subjective. But if you reframe it through this more biological lens, it turns out there's nothing intangible about well-being at all. Because the fact is, for life, to be able to utilize the perception of well-being to enhance fitness, this could only happen if it was exceedingly tangible. Because remember, bacteria are doing this. Bacteria don't have brains. Bacteria don't have language. The squirrels that just ran across my window view there, they have a brain, but they don't have language. So for this to be useful to living things, it has to be exceedingly concrete. And that's the value of well-being. It makes fitness concrete. And so we all have very concrete and tangible feelings. We know when we feel sick. We know when we feel loved. We know when we feel satisfied or satiated. If I just ate an ice cream cone, I feel really good. If you ask me to describe it, I might be challenged to describe why I feel good. But I'm not confused about whether I feel good or not, whether I enjoyed it or not. And so the challenge is really about thinking about how to capture that very visceral, tangible moment. And lo and behold, it turns out there's a wealth of data available that people like me have been collecting from users of museums for decades. As we've asked people to tell us what does it feel like? What does it look like when you have a good museum experience? And we've got data, and we have data on how people describe why they go to museums, what makes the experience satisfying. There's just a wealth of data out there. So the magic that I used was to convert that data, even though people didn't talk about it in terms of well-being. The magic was to say, well, I can build on that because I have specific insights now into how people describe these good experiences. So let's ask people, did you have those good experiences or not? But then the other part that was really, really important was to remember that we have learned over evolutionary and cultural time that the most valuable things are the things that persist. So eating an ice cream cone is great, but the good feelings that come from eating an ice cream cone don't persist very long. As compared to getting a kiss and a hug from my partner when I wake up in the morning, that's a good feeling that can and often lasts an entire day. That has more value than just eating an ice cream cone. And if it lasts for more than a day, it has even more value to me. So you can't, as most museum research has done, just ask people as they're sitting in the museum, even though it's convenient. So tell me what the long-term value of this is to you, because I don't know as I'm sitting here in the museum. You actually have to wait. And so even though logistically it's more difficult, you have to track people down weeks or maybe even months after their museum experience, and then ask them, did you have this experience? And if so, how long did it last? Because the longer it lasts, the greater the value. And that's what I did in a pilot study. And if you'd like.
Please let us know more about it. And my institution, Heureka, was part of it.
Absolutely. So as I conceptualized this, I thought, well, I've got to actually collect data. If I'm going to talk about this, let's put my money where my mouth is. So on a shoestring, without any funding, I put out a notice and said, here's what I'm trying to do. Would anybody be interested in, being a guinea pig? And I was fortunate that 6 institutions, including Mikko's at Heureka in Finland, agreed to be guinea pigs and to allow me to do a pilot study. And so there were 6 institutions initially who agreed to cooperate. So there was Heureka in Northern Europe, Finland, 3 in the United States, Billings Farm and Museum, which is a living history museum with pigs and cows and chickens, 19th century farming techniques up in Vermont. And there was a Museum of Life and Science, which is sort of a hybrid natural history museum, science museum, children's museum, which is down in North Carolina, moderate sized museum. There was the Nebraska History Museum, which is a small history museum, state history museum in Nebraska in the Midwest. The Toronto Zoo, big zoo in Toronto, Canada. And also in Canada, out of Toronto, is a place called the Museum of Toronto, which is a really interesting place, very different, because it's a virtual museum. It doesn't have a building. And all of its programs, by and large, are virtual, particularly over the last few years. So real interesting mix of institutions. But again, the methodology that I've created, and again, inherent in this notion, is it's not about the content. It's subject free. It's whether you had an experience that enhanced your sense of self, your sense of awe, your sense of wonder. That can happen in a history museum. It can happen in a science museum. It can happen in an art museum. Did you have a great social experience? Did you learn stuff that you wanted to know about that you didn't know about? Did it give you a sense of empowerment? Did you spend good time with your family or friends? Did you feel comfortable? Did you feel safe? Did you feel recharged? And I asked people, how long did you have that experience, and how long did it last? if you had that experience, did it last a couple hours? Did it last a day? Did it last a week? Did it last several weeks? And virtually 100% of all the people that we surveyed said, yeah, I had an experience like that, at least one of those experiences, and it enhanced my well-being. And on average, that duration of well-being lasted, on average, nearly a week for everybody. So far beyond the brief time that I was in the museum, this lasted not just hours, not just days, but in most cases, multiple days, a week. And in some cases, it lasted weeks. In fact, in some cases, I actually had arbitrarily said 2 weeks or longer, and the mean response was 2 weeks or longer, which means that everybody answered that, which means I have to actually extend that timeline even further because I hit a ceiling. And then I was also able to measure that financial value of that, because in fact, people can say, well, so what is it worth to you to have a good quality experience with your loved one? What is it worth to you if it lasts an hour? What is it worth to you if it lasts a day? What is it worth to you if it lasts a week? What is it worth to you if it lasts several weeks? People can answer that question. But the key to this, and what separates this approach from essentially all the previous research that's been done on trying to do this in museums, is an insight that I had, and it wasn't accidental because I made the same mistake initially as everybody else. I began by saying, you know, when you went to the museum and you had these experiences, in the pilot that preceded your pilot with you, I did a pilot before I did the pilot with you, Mikko. What people did was, there's an inherent bias. Go figure. We as a society are conditioned to believe that there is a one-to-one relationship between cost and value. So if you ask me what the value of this pen is, and I bought it for $2, well, I assume that the value must be about $2 because that's what I paid for it. And there is a one-to-one relationship, right, between cost and value. We've been conditioned to believe this. Now, if you ask me how much this pen is worth, which was given to me by a hotel, it actually costs about 39 cents. So I assume this must be a pretty cheap pen. So it must have a value of about a quarter or 40 cents. Now, both pens do the same thing. They both write. And you could argue which is the better pen. But if you hold up these two pens to me and say, which is more valuable, I'll say it's this one because I know this one costs more, right? So if I really want to know how people believe the value of a pen is, I can't do it by asking people to rate these pens. What I have to do is say, what if you had a tool that would allow you to write on a piece of paper anything you wanted to write, and that writing would be indelible and would last? What if that writing lasted an hour? What would that be worth to you? What if that writing on a piece of paper lasted a day? What would that be? What if that writing lasted a year? What would that be worth to you? And the value would go up proportionally. And so that's how I approach this problem. I had to actually collect data separately about value in terms of the monetary value, and separately the value that people felt that they got from a specific experience. So the more specific you can make it, people can answer that. Generically, what is the value of a museum experience? That's really hard to answer. In fact, arguably it's impossible to answer. And if you ask me what that value is, I'll say, well, it's probably the price I paid. But of course, museums work really hard to keep their price down because they get paid to keep their price down. They're subsidized. They want to make it less expensive. So bottom line, the average value of museum experience in my pilot study was about $300 to $400 US per person. And the return on investment was about $200 for every dollar spent. That's pretty,
Wow.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now this pilot... In
percentage, that's incredible.
Yes.
That goes to thousands.
The average return on investment you can expect from a good investment is 10 cents on the dollar. So if you spend $1, you make $1.10. So now you're this, and that's typically what the return on investment has been measured for profit and not for profit businesses. But $200 value, that's golden. And so the next step is to do this more systematically, and we can talk further about this at some point, but we're about to launch into a major study in Finland with 7, maybe 8 Finnish museums to really do this more rigorously. And I'm excited about that. But onward, I know where time's marching on here.
Yeah, just one more question about this. What do you expect to happen in this more rigorous study? I mean, will the data just be more convincing, or what might happen? What is your hypothesis?
Well, my hypothesis is that it will be, we can say after doing a study like that, we'll be able to make our claims much more authoritatively and with much greater confidence. Because obviously in the pilot study, we were dealing with a relatively modest sample size. We had several hundred people from Heureka participate. But in some cases, the data was less than 100 people. We will be able, instead of just collecting data from whoever self-selected to answer, we can collect data more systematically and more randomly so that we can get a better indication of the true value that this created for all users. We actually will have the statistical power to compare, for example, if we wanted to, regular visitors with first-time visitors or programs with exhibitions. Obviously, we can't have all those variables, but we can pick a couple key variables and we can actually make those comparisons. And so that's what we'll be able to do with a bigger, badder study.
Thanks. When I've been discussing this with my colleagues here in Finland, the museum directors, if they would like to join this research, some of them have mentioned a concern that, okay, this book and this study and John Falk is from North America, and we are in Europe, and cultural offerings are differently valued, maybe they are differently priced, they are differently subsidized. And my answer to them has been, well, that's all true, but isn't that the reason that we should study this? Because then we will find out.
Yes.
But as I'm going on with my discussions with the colleagues here, would you have me better answers than what I gave them?
Sure. Well, the 2 answers I can give you are all, first of all, for example, the research that's been done on visitor motivations, why do people go to museums? The initial frameworks that I developed, for example, here in North America, and other colleagues developed frameworks in Australia, and other colleagues developed frameworks in Europe, and there have been colleagues doing this work in Asia, but they all converge on these same basic ideas. Now, how we obviously talk about those outcomes are cultural, and we'll be sure that when we ask the questions, we ask them in a way that makes sense to a Finnish audience, which I know even when you translated the questions that I wrote, I'm sure they weren't word for word literal translations. So they have to, so the questions have to be culturally relevant. But as I said, this is fundamental human nature we're talking about. This is not about Finnish human nature. This is not about American human nature. Every human has personal, intellectual, social, and physical well-being needs. And so if we can talk about what those might look like within a museum context in Finland, we're golden. The other thing that was really surprising to me and interesting, but again, my sample size was not sufficient that I could make this claim with huge confidence, but I collected this valuation data. So what is this worth? I collected that in the local currency of 3 different countries, in euros in Finland, in Canadian dollars in Canada and US dollars in the US. But when I converted those all into US dollars, there was no significant difference in the valuation across those three countries. And so I ended up combining all the data to come up with my index, my valuation index for each of those outcomes. Now, obviously, we'll collect more data and I'll have more confidence in that data. But at least you can tell your colleagues that, at least based on the pilot data, people in Finland rated the monetary value of these outcomes exactly comparable to people in North America. And so that's pretty reassuring as well.
Excellent, John. Okay, let's go to the very last question in my script before we open up for questions from the audience.
Sure.
And let's look at the future. I mean, beyond the research, let's look at the museum profession and how museums will operate. How do you think, if we take this seriously, and I think we should take this seriously, what you are proposing in your book, how would this, in the best case, influence and impact the short-term and long-term museum operation?
Well, I think it provides a tool that can help us think about both the short and the long term. First, in the short term, if we understand that the major outcome that people are deriving from museum experiences, be they whether they're programs or exhibitions, is well-being, this gives us a tool to begin to say, well, how do we define what those personal well-being outcomes might be? What do they look like, and how can we maximize those? What about intellectual well-being? What about social well-being, physical well-being? And I take a stab in my book, in the final chapter, of laying out 10. There probably could be 20 or 30 or 40 of them, but I thought 10 was a manageable number. 10 key principles of how you could take these insights and apply them to making better museum experiences, increase the quality of the programs and exhibitions that you currently create. And they include things like allowing users to co-create and own their own experiences, because if you remember, it all starts with the individual and their needs. So it has to speak to their needs, their aspirations. It should figure out ways to surprise and delight, allow people to have choice and control, give users a reason for keep doing it, not just once, but multiple times, not just when they go to a museum or a program, but keep doing it. Obviously, social is really important. Make it easy to do with others and support sharing. We live in a world of social media. Make it easy for people to share the experiences with others. And obviously, it needs to be comfortable, convenient, and feel safe and secure. At any rate, there are all those details. But equally, if not more importantly, I think what should be self-evident to everyone is that the world is rapidly changing, and museums need to change too. If we're going to continue to persist, let alone thrive in the coming decades, we need to have new ways to think about the value that we create. And it all starts with our missions. And if I can be critical for a moment, the missions of most museums are still rooted in 19th, 20th century thinking about who we are and what we do. Specifically, virtually every museum begins with talking about, if they don't talk about their collection specifically, they talk about their collection generically in terms of art or history or science. But, that is a 19th, 20th century construct of how to make sense of knowledge. That is not how we live in the 21st century. We're dealing with all kinds of issues that threaten our individual and collective well-being. Things like climate change and social inequity and global pandemics, and threats posed to our livelihood and identities by new technologies such as automation and artificial intelligence. And so museums need to be vehicles for dealing with these kinds of challenges. And every human on the planet is going to have to deal with that. But the wonder of this model is that the threats may be different and the strategies that we use to support our well-being may be different. But we and our children and our grandchildren have the same basic needs that our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents had. All humans, we're all the, we are the offspring, we are the progeny of people who survived because they figured out ways to enhance their personal, intellectual, social, and physical well-being. And our descendants will be the survivors who will be the ones who manage to equally support their personal, intellectual, social, and physical well-being. And museums need to be the vehicle for doing that. The one thing we need to figure out how to do is become a vehicle for not only enhancing the individual well-being of the few, but increasingly the collective well-being of the many. I can't tell you exactly how to do that, and I can assure you that transition will not be smooth. But I believe that this new book and the ideas that I presented provide a compass for how to navigate that pathway and guide the journey towards creating a better and more sustainable well-being enhancing future. Oops, and somehow you're muted, Mikko.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
I really love the optimistic approach you have to the future of our profession and the future of museums if we understand our role. Now I would like to hand backstage to Colleen to arrive and take care of the cues in order to John to provide to Ace. Thanks, John, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Hi, John. It's such a fascinating conversation. We had a question from Kate. She wanted to know, are you interested in and will you investigate how people define for themselves the value of a museum experience as subcategories of creating well-being?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Obviously at the moment, the approach I've taken is not so much an individual approach, but a collective approach, trying to understand how institutions collectively support well-being. But again, what I believe I am creating here is a conceptual tool that people could apply to asking lots of different questions and potentially solving lots of different issues, coming up with different answers. And so you clearly could take this approach and begin to delve into how individuals collectively support their well-being through museum experiences. But as I suggested, we already have a wealth of data that provides some insights into that. Again, it hasn't been framed in this way, but we have that data. And we variously talked about it. Tell me about what you remember from your museum experience. Tell me why you went to the museum today. Tell me, a week, a month, a year later, tell me what the meaning was, the value that you derived. So we have a lot of individual data already, but you could do this more systematically as well in the future.
So John, is it possible then to take your method and use that for something like, a walk in the park or a bicycle ride or something like that, and be able to compare the museum experience to present that to policymakers as a reason why that enhanced experience should be so supported?
Yep, bingo, you're absolutely right. And in fact, at one point I was tempted to write the book rather than focus on museums that just talk about how does one measure societal well-being, because actually this could be applied to healthcare, could be applied to schools, it could be applied to a walk in the park. And hopefully, if you did that, you would also get values, and hopefully you would find that museum experiences measured up really well to those other kinds of experiences. This is not how we've traditionally measured the outcomes. Schooling, historically, the only way we have measured and monetized, for example, higher education in the United States is how it supports whether you get a better job, your economic value. Well, that's a pretty narrow way to look at higher education. In fact, it's a pretty damning way to look at higher education, because the results suggest, when you do it that way, that the median outcome of the return on investment of a 4/5 year college education is break even, which means that half the people who paid for their higher education lost money over a lifetime, and only half actually showed any positive gain, and most of those gains were minimal. It's only literally the top 5% of schools in the country that deliver significant return on investment when you look at it through that very narrow economic lens. And when you look at K-12 education, the return on investment is negative, 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 negative. It's a negative, it's 0.02% return on investment. Break even is 100%. So think about that. Break even investment, if you spend $1 and you get $1 back, that's 100% return on investment. K-12 schooling is 0.02% return on investment. But that's looking at through the lens of increased employment. But one would like to believe that there are greater value to going to school than that. Maybe, maybe not. But to the point, I will put one day at the museum up against any one day in school, anytime, if we can measure it in the way that I'm talking about, in terms of providing and supporting long-term well-being for people. And I think if we do those metrics and are able to do those metrics, we'll find that museum experiences are really competitive and really valuable.
I totally agree. I totally agree. So final question, we had some interest in participating in your studies. Is there a way to contact you, or
operators are standing by. 1-800. No, seriously, if you put my email in the chat, or I guess I'll put my email in the chat, just contact me. Let me do that. I'm not sure I can, at the moment, all I can do is send to hosts and panelists. So Colleen,
I'll pull it up.
Yeah, send them my email, and
Okay.
All cards and letters are accepted. No, I'd be thrilled to have people participate. I'm in the process of putting together some consortia to do this. The first off the blocks is this group in Finland, but there's room for others, and I would be happy to talk to anybody about doing this. I think it would be way cool. The more, the merrier.
All right. Well, at that point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Walter, since we only have just a couple of minutes left, and I will get your email up in the chat.
Cool. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for as Colleen said, a fascinating conversation. And I'm going a little bit out of my role here, because I have a question on my own here,
okay.
and it relates to what I said in the beginning. Is from our perspective as museum experts, we are also looking of how people working in museums are living that experience. And from my point of view, I've not heard enough on how this well-being that museum offers is a contribution of people who are working in museums. And the reason why I'm saying that is that when we speak with all the museum experts that are on our list server and who come to these webinars, etc., when we talk about their careers in the future, they have a hard time quitting and finding other places to work, because they are so passionate about what they do. And one of the reasons why they are so passionate is because they really are convinced that they provide to the visitors this kind of experience that contribute to that well-being that you described. And so I was wondering, what place can you give to the museum staffers and professionals in that concept?
Well, and I don't know if this is the answer that you're hoping for, or whether this will really be the answer. But again, A good theory is worth a lot. And if this theory is correct, this provides a key to not only how to be a successful museum professional, it provides a key to how to be a successful professional in any domain. To the extent that well-being, personal, intellectual, social, physical well-being is a critical need that everybody is seeking. People are seeking it whether they go to a museum, they're seeking it when they go to the doctor, they're seeking it when they go to the grocery store. If you have an insight and understand that this is the ultimate value you are delivering, this provides an insight into how to be a more successful museum employee, but this would provide insight into how you could actually pitch yourself in terms of a new job as well. Because you could say, I understand the basic needs that your organization provides, and I have experience in providing those basic needs, and those skills are transferable. I can take what I've learned about supporting the well-being of the public in this space, and I can apply it to supporting the well-being in your space. Hire me and I'll show you how to make it happen.
Well, and I know preconception of what you answered. Certainly, you did say a number of things that I was really would support, and that really aligns with things that we try to do with our members of Museum Expert. So again, we are at the end of the session. Thank you, John, for this fascinating conversation. Thanks, Mikko, for being so interactive and so thoughtful with your questions and we are really looking forward to the outcomes of that survey. I want to thank again AAM for the support here, for all the people who were here, and I would say if you have more questions, I think that John would be happy to respond. If you,
I would, and hopefully, buy the book. You might even find some of the answers in there. And my publisher will be happy if you do.
Sure. And so there are a few questions that have not been answered here, and so I'm sure that if you write to John, he's going to be happy to.
Yep, absolutely.
So look forward to the next email with the recording of this, and make sure that you share the recording because we noticed that the recordings are usually even more attended than the live sessions. So which is the case with many of these online events. And so also look, if you have not registered with Museum Expert yet, please do so you will keep updated of all the activities that we do. Next one is and a little bit aligning with what we just discussed about the professions and how to build your profession and your career. We are having a session with the Heather Broad about how to use design methods to change your mindset to build your career. And so that is on the 11th, on the 9th of November, in 3 weeks or so. And we hope that you will be there as well. What we're going to do starting from that is hoping that people will self-organize amongst themselves and use these design methods to start conversations among themselves on how to build their careers future, whether it's in a museum or outside in a museum, using the skills that they have learned or that they have acquired in museums or not. Thank you again. Thank you all. And we see you next time.